Hi, I'm Alex Howard, and welcome to Conscious 2. My guest in the studio today is Richard Wilson. Hi, Richard.
Hi.
And Richard is standing as a People Power MP at the next general election here in the UK in 2015. And we think this is the first time that somebody has done this in this country. And it's particularly interesting for Conscious 2 because one of the things here that really is fascinating is how inner work meets the outer world. And when someone's been on an inner path of development, how they can then use that to try and transform the world. And there are a few structures more established and in some ways rigid than the political world. So I'm really excited to get into this dialogue. But maybe, Richard, as a starting point, what is a People Power MP? What is it that you're actually doing?
It's a good question because there's a way in which we don't know exactly, but what's important about it is that we're starting from the position of always asking the people what they want. So, for example, on every iconic issue like military intervention, NHS reform, anything like that, there'll be a poll run within the Stroud constituency, and I will do whatever they tell me to do. And that's how we'll do everything, basically. We'll basically always ask how they want me to run the job. And I'm really interested in completely reimagining the job for the 21st century. So having people from the constituency coming up to vote in Parliament, potentially even doing a job share to have a more diverse role. So really looking at the whole 5 years, if we won, as an opportunity to think, how can we make this really outdated structure work, both for the people of Stroud, but also, I think, for the MPs and politics themselves. Because when I speak to MPs, most of them complain about being overstretched, disconnected, undervalued. So for me, it feels like this is something I know a bit about, and I can probably shake this system up, and this is my best attempt to do it.
Because I think one of the things that clearly a lot of people feel disillusioned and frustrated by politics.
Yeah.
And, there's a whole thing in this country kind of inspired by Russell Brand and his whole kind of comments on the political system. And if nothing else, it engages people and it shows that people are frustrated. We're going to come more into that, but I particularly want to get, for you personally, why are you doing this? It's a huge amount of work and taking on a system which is, hundreds of years in kind of developing its structure. So what inspired this for you?
It's a really good question because I think it's only a few weeks ago that we kind of had the idea. So it's very, very fresh. So I was sitting in the pub by my house, the Crown and Sceptre in Stroud, on the day after the Scottish referendum with my friend Tom. And we were just discussing how it's kind of amazing. I think we were all really inspired by what happened in Scotland. And we just thought to ourselves, isn't that what politics should be like all of the time? And that, I don't know if you remember that morning, but the Westminster politicians were already closing down that window of people power. They was kind of giving a fig leaf of devolution to the northern cities and to Scotland. And it felt like they were given a real scare by that because, Scotland almost, went independent. And we thought to ourselves, well, couldn't it be like that all the time? And so, and because me and my friend Tom work in this space, we build these kind of structures. We thought, well, why don't we give it a go? And why don't we just ask, are people in Stroud interested in this? So it's just 1 week ago we asked, are people interested? Within 1 week we've had, we think we're the second highest liked Facebook page in Stroud. And so we just feel like there's energy there. And so I think from our perspective, it feels like the time is right. And what's been amazing about what Russell Brand's been doing is he's created this appetite for change. And you can get into the detail about whether this is a good idea or a bad idea, but my starting place is that politics is broken. We've got so many issues like climate change, like jobs and growth that aren't working as well as they should be. And in my view, not changing the system is not an option. Now, I've got an idea of how to start that change process. I don't know exactly where it's going to end, but I feel really obligated and called to try and make that change happen.
One of the things that was so remarkable, you touched on around the Scottish referendum, was the turnout was it something like 80%? I can't remember the number, but it was something like totally unheard of in politics. And I was talking with some of my friends around that and around the general election, and I was stunned at how few people even bother to vote. And, I know it's very easy to get into a kind of thing of how bad things are. And there are things that I agree that are broken that need to be fixed. And yet we have a democracy which, compared to some other countries, is extraordinary, the freedoms that we have.
Yeah.
And yet people don't even exercise that right to vote.
Yeah.
And that does say something about how disillusioned people feel. That they don't feel that their vote counts. They don't feel it's really meaningful. They feel that whoever they vote for, they basically get a version of the same thing.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering of what your thoughts are around how you see this engaging people, because that seems to be one of the fundamental issues in politics, disengagement. So how do you see this changing that?
So in a very simple way, it becomes about issues. So people care about fracking, people might care about NHS reform, they might care about military intervention in Iraq. I mean, there are all kinds of issues. It might be hunting. I don't know what it is that floats your boat, but there are also many issues that we're really, really passionate about. So all of a sudden, politics becomes about issues and not about parties. And that, for me, feels like it's going to be really helpful for that engagement element. Going beyond that, I actually think you're giving people this real power, forcing people to have the maturity to say, okay, well, you could complain about your MP voting or not voting, but actually you are going to have a say. So, for example, after the Iraq War, when most of us sit here, feeling embarrassed to be British because of the decision our government made at that time, if you can remember back to that day, what decision were you thinking at the time? And I think there's just something about when it forces us to really engage with the issue, it brings an aliveness. And one of the things, and you could look at it from a sort of more sort of spiritual perspective, is that I think it's the danger, it's the juice, it's the possibility that gives it its real potency. Because on these issues, you lose control. You don't know what side we're going to vote on fracking. You don't know what side people are going to vote in terms of military intervention in Iraq. And because of that, because of the eddying and the power in that process, all of a sudden an aliveness comes.
Yes.
And that's what I'm interested in.
And maybe just tell us a little bit about your background as well, because I know that you've had a pretty interesting life of this kind of exploring both the inner and the outer. So maybe just touch a little bit on, for example, some of your inner path, like things that have inspired you, things that have perhaps brought you to this place.
Sure. So I mean, in terms of my own journey here, so I started off being an environmental economist. Then I became an environmental lobbyist in Parliament. That was my job. And very quickly I got disillusioned by the process, and I started working as a kind of community organizer. But what happened to me is I became really aware that people were kind of very much focused on their issues. There was this idea that I am right and you are wrong. And I remember myself, being an environmental campaigner, basically saying we need, say, a carbon tax, and I'd be talking to corporates, and they'd be like, no, we don't. And that's kind of how it was. And I would tend to, and this is when I was in my early 20s, and I tend to say, no, I'm right and you're wrong. And what has certainly happened to me in terms of my journey is I've realized how, that's just not helpful. And there's something that I think happened, say in the Scottish referendum, where it forced people in families to come together and be very authentic, kind of warts and all. No, I'm for it, and why? You're against it, and why? And I think that there's something about authentically meeting as real people and standing. So it's not about, I'm not trying to convince you that you should be in favor of fracking or because I happen to be against it. It's about being able to really live together as different people and authentically respect one another. And I think one of the big problems in politics at the moment, it's not just with the politicians, it's also with the kind of campaigners sometimes. It's like this idea that I am right and you are wrong. Yes. And we actually just isolate ourselves. Whereas what I'm interested in is bringing us all together, not forcing us to have the same opinions, but being with one another in terms of our authentic beliefs about a specific issue.
You touched on fracking, and it's a really good example of, we did a previous interview on your book, Antihero, exploring kind of around that, and I really liked the way you talked about kind of dealing with this kind of complexity. But it's a good example of something that kind of is one of my questions around this whole process, that I often think that people want to be treated like adults, but behave like children. And I think fracking is a really good example of a complex issue, because I'm on the same path as you. I'm a no to fracking, but I'm also a no to nuclear, and I'm also a no to coal, and I'm a yes to renewable energy sources, but I'm a no to paying lots more tax to pay for it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm basically no to everything,
Yeah.
which then doesn't solve the problem. And I think one of the great difficulties in politics, like another example would be something like the NHS. The NHS is basically bankrupt in this country. And it's like, I don't want to pay loads more tax, but I also want to have a great national health service, and we've got an aging population, we've got higher expectations of healthcare, and we have these incredibly complicated issues that people want to have an answer that they like, but an answer they like doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And I wonder how that's going to meet people power politics, where people are presented with issues where often politicians don't really lay out the complexity because they're not electable if they say, basically, we're going to have to tax you loads more and you have to lower your expectations. How do you see meeting those really complex problems in a way that people aren't going to invest the time in necessarily understanding the issues?
So if we take on the first part of this around looking at a wicked issue where there isn't an easy answer, like energy, for example, the fracking issue. So one of the beauties about being a people power MP is I am not going to, I don't say I have the answer. I say I will support a process for you to come up with your own conclusion. So we'll aggregate stuff online, the good ideas, and we'll support local debates and we'll video them, but it will be about people coming together, acknowledging those differences, and then voting based upon an informed opinion. Now, and I think what's useful about that is that we won't have to necessarily, so people who want a more complex element of that will be able to get into the detail around it. Some people who don't can, just, so for example, if you had a poll today in Stroud on fracking, I know my opinion, I'm going to be against it. I have read a lot about it. People that maybe don't know about it but want to know could talk to their friends. So I think it catalyzes this debate, which forces us out of this, this kind of sleep we are in relation to these issues. Because at the moment, by devolving our power to an MP, by devolving our power effectively to the media, because we choose our institutions to get our information from, it really forces us to to meet the complexity around these things, and hopefully we'll get a situation whereby this kind of unhelpful yes or no response breaks down. And I think in particular the way in which MPs speaking often in this sort of platitudinal, simplistic way, will also begin to disintegrate because they're not seeking necessarily to get re-elected.
Yes, although I can imagine, playing devil's advocate for a moment, I can imagine a scenario with fracking that, so we vote no to fracking, and then a vote comes up around nuclear, we vote no to that. And then a vote comes up around building more coal power stations. We vote no to that. Yeah. And it's like we're a no to everything, but then we don't actually solve the problem, that we have to find a way. And then there's a carbon tax, let's say, that comes in. And the carbon tax is going to be used to invest in renewable energies. Yeah. And we vote no to that. We don't pay more tax. So then we don't actually solve the problem because we don't like any of the solutions. And I think one of the ways that I sometimes think about politics, it's a little bit like being a parent. It's like you say to your child, do you want, do you want spinach for tea? No. Do you want green beans tea? No. What they want is pizza, but they can't have it. It's not good for them. So if they're given their way, they'll have pizza and they'll be overweight and they can't concentrate. So there's a place where an adult has to make a difficult decision, and we have to do something we don't want to do. And I just wonder if we have a people power politics that actually the difficult decisions just won't get made because people won't want to deal with the fact they have to take a decision. They have to deal with some of these issues that don't have simple solutions.
So for me, the response is very simple. You can either trust the politicians to not say no every time, or you can trust the people to come up with more constructive solutions. I think the people are more likely to come up with more progressive solutions than the MPs we have at the moment, who are operating within these constrained systems that often don't force them to be imaginative. So I have a personal belief that people are more likely to take more sensible decisions than politicians. And when you look at things like which issues would you vote for, and you have this online, which party should you support based on the issues that you like, pretty much everyone supports the Green. It's like Greens become the biggest party in the UK based on issues.
Wow.
So if you look at that kind of data of what people seem to prefer, they seem to be supporting much more progressive solutions on energy than what our parties do.
Even if they have to pay more tax.
So, that would be part of the conversation. But so for me, I think keeping things as they are is not an option.
Yeah.
And this is my best guess of changing it.
Yeah.
And so the risk, for me, so we've got kind of two options in my head. Either we keep things as they are, and things are gonna get really bad. It's inevitable. Or we can try something that changes things, and it might make things much better.
Yeah. And again, because as you know, I'm on your side of this, but I also want to be provocative around it, because I also, just take climate change a little bit further. I know you and I share a belief that climate change is a really serious issue.
Yeah.
And if you look at some reports, it's potentially like having, it's a terminal issue, like for certainly human beings on planet Earth. And those kinds of issues, we don't have a lot of time to learn and go through change and figure it out. Like, we need to take action, and action that's probably unpopular, going to not be particularly supported, but it needs to happen. And it's like, Stroud's an interesting constituency, because I think I'm right in saying that it's a fairly green-minded area.
Yeah.
But I get nervous if issues like climate change, we put it in the hands of the masses, and again, I think I hear what I'm saying, and I think I make myself unpopular here, but one way to look at it is, if you put healthcare choices in the hands of the masses, just look at the data, you see a massive increase in chronic illness, which is caused by diet, smoking, lack of exercise. Most people don't take care of their body, and it's totally unsustainable. It feels good in the short term, so people do it, but in the long term, it's terminal for their body. And I just get really nervous about that when I think about politics. And yet, I totally agree with you. The current system doesn't work.
Mm.
And so I guess that what part of what my question is this people power politics is partly about giving people a say, but you also were talking about how do we shake the system up? Like, how do we change the way that things are done? And I'm curious as to how else you see that being possible. Like, one of the things that you mentioned was around job sharing, about getting people more engaged, more inspired in politics. How tell us more about that?
So I suppose in terms of the first element of the kind of question, I just have a belief, again, that if we trust the people, they're going to be quicker and more effective than our current institutions that were built hundreds of years ago. My first job was working with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I wish it could work. I wish the UN institutions would work, but they are roundly failing. And so, having been doing this kind of stuff now, both in grassroots communities and at the UN and in all the places in between, I'm pretty convinced that this is the best option we've got for doing something different. And so that's my view on that side of things. In terms of inspiring people in politics, so I think there's all kinds of ideas. So, for example, I love the idea of it not being just me that's making the vote in Parliament, but actually it being Stroud constituents. I don't know if that's legal. But if it isn't, then I'm interested in having...
Make it legal.
Exactly.
Right.
Having campaigns. Because I think there's also this problem that we have in Westminster where we have this elite club that people feel necessarily excluded from. And I don't think it's good for Westminster, and I don't think it's good for the people. And so I am really interested in ways of changing that. I'm also really interested in ways of, for example, if we're going to have people voting on laws, why are the laws... I've been just playing around online, posting up the current bills, if people are going to have petitions on them, and they're like, they're really, really long. So we'd have to do like what 38 Degrees are doing and make it much simpler to engage with. So I think this is all part of an innovation process to try and make politics work for the 21st century. And because we are going to live or die by the level of engagement, we get the incentives. It's like having a really good market. If no one votes for the way we're doing things, then I will have failed. So the market's really effective. Whereas, as you all know, how politics works at the moment, people get parachuted into seats. They're often determined by central party. The link between the individual and the broad people is incredibly weak. And another reason why I think this is really important. So we're seeing the movement at the moment towards the extremes. UKIP is a really good example of that. And I think that's partly because the centre ground of our politics has become so withered. It's become the disconnection is so poor that's forcing people to extremes. And I actually think when you talk to people who are supporting some of the more extreme parties, you might say Green on one side or UKIP on the other, it's often because the middle parties, are so disconnected from, the centre ground of this country. And so this also, for me, represents an opportunity to really create direct connection between people and power. And that's got to be healthy, I think.
It's interesting, you mentioned UKIP. And for people watching this abroad, UKIP are basically, I don't know how to quite describe them. I guess they're a fairly right-wing party, which are very focused around getting out of Europe and anti-immigration and have a pretty strong position around that. And they've attracted remarkable support for a party which, if you really break down what they believe and the roots of where they come from, it's actually quite terrifying.
But if you look at some of the people who want to vote for UKIP, I mean, a lot of them have actually got pretty, reasonable wants. They've got, for example, I think most people who vote for UKIP want to have to renationalize, have got renationalization of major industries. Some of them are, interested in the immigration question. And for me, things like these hot issues like immigration. We live in the south of England. There's 30 million people that live down here, one of the most densely populated parts of the world. Let's talk about it, because as an environmentalist, so on a personal level, I have a general view of I like the idea of economic movement because I think it's about equity and economic fairness. But I love our nature. I mean, for me, on a spiritual level, some people go to Mecca, some people go to Rome, some people go to St. Paul's Cathedral. I go to the countryside around where I live, and I really, really care about it being protected. But as our population increases, that gets really hard. And so these things are all intertwined. And one of the beauties about having an issues-based politics is we can talk about the issues. We don't say you're Labour or you're Tory or you're UKIP because it oversimplifies who we are as people. Yes. So almost, again, getting back to that sort of that authentic connection with what we care about, these parties, they just flatten out. They're a really low resolution of who we are as people. What I'm interested in is a high definition sense of who we are, what we believe in, and how we can change things.
And I think one of the fundamental problems of the way politics works is for parties to get elected, they have to find enough people to tell them what they want to hear. But often they tell them what they want to hear knowing they can't deliver it all. And it's a kind of it's bizarre. It's like promising, I'll do this, I'll do that for you. And of course they run whole metrics on if we do this, we'll lose those, win those people. But the reality is you can't do most of those things. And I guess it leads me on to a kind of final area I wanted to explore, which is what's the potential for this? Yeah. If you could wave a magic wand and redesign politics, what it's probably a lifetime's work. But for a number of people, but what do you hope this could become?
So the starting point is, so what we're doing in Stroud is we're coming up with a job description for how we want our MP to behave around people power, and any MP. Neil Carmichael, the Conservative, David Drew, the Labour guys, or the Greens, they are all very welcome to take on this job description. I'm currently standing because no one else is coming forward, but anyone can do it. And anyone around the UK, or frankly the world, could do this. And what's worth saying is this is part of a movement. So you've got the Five Star Movement in Italy, you've got the Pirate Party in Sweden and other countries, and there's in my view, in 20 to 30 years' time, our politics is going to be completely different. It's obvious that the Conservatives are going to split. We all know that already. That's pretty obvious. I think it's pretty obvious that you're going to see splits in other parties. And so it feels like one way or another, we're heading in that direction. We're heading towards a very different kind of politics. And so I'm kind of amazed that no one else has come up with this idea, because to me it seems so self-evident. And so for me, this is kind of an inevitable passage for us reconnecting people with politics and having a much more mature relationship with how we can change the world.
So last minute or so, someone that's watching this that feels inspired by what you're saying, if they live in Stroud, they can vote for you. If they don't live in Stroud, what can they do? Like you mentioned, for example, that you're designing more it's not really about you this, although you're the person standing in Stroud. Yeah. You're designing a process so someone, I guess, could stand in another constituency if they wanted to.
Absolutely. So I mean, you can get in touch with us, mystroud.org or rich@mystroud.org or Twitter @mystroudmp will get in touch with us, and we will help anyone to try and make this happen. And the kind of way we're thinking about it at the moment is that also if you're a part of a party, so what's really important is we're not being anti-candidate or anti-party. It's a really central part of our campaign is to be positive, because I think that most politicians actually work hard under difficult circumstances. We've got to remember that most of the councillors effectively doing a voluntary job. And so our idea is that we've got this, is that anyone can be part of this. And many Labour MPs, they are also members of the Cooperative Party because they can balance it out like that. What we're going to offer is this My MP thing. So if any MP, any candidate, independent or not, wishes to be part of this process, they are very welcome.
Wonderful. Well, I have to say I'm genuinely inspired by what you're doing. I really wish you the best of luck with it. Thank you, Richard, for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. And we look forward to talking to you again here on Conscious 2, hopefully very soon. Bye-bye.